Welcome. I'm J.R. Kerr of Goal 17 Partners, and I'm honored to welcome you to our discussion this evening and this morning, Women in the Workforce. How has the pandemic impacted gender equality? This is the second panel of a three-part online series hosted by Goal 17 Partners in collaboration with our great partners, Global Perspectives, focused on Japan and the broader Asian region. Goal 17 is a non-for-profit organization that works with the private sector to create more effective partnerships to help accomplish the Sustainable Development Goals. Our work is dedicated to delivering business solutions to sustainability, equality, and accessibility, a bold vision and an integrated agenda represented by the SDGs. We carry out this work through our network, through workshops that educate private sector leaders on ways to support SDG achievement, and then ultimately through hosting convenings like this one that we're organizing this today. Our platform is meant to showcase the work of our partners, and we have a number of strong partners in Japan and the broader Asian region who are leaders and drivers of action on the SDGs, all well represented by today's panel. We are pleased to be hosting this series with its specific focus on Asia to highlight and support the efforts of leading companies and help drive continued conversations and momentum around these important issues. We also plan to continue these conversations at numerous touch points throughout the year, including the UN General Assembly Week in September, which will be held virtually, the World Economic Forum annual meeting in January, which we believe will be both virtual and physical, and next year in Tokyo, if the Olympics continue as planned, and we certainly hope that they do. We hope that all of you will join us in our efforts at these events and beyond to move this agenda forward. Now I'd like to introduce our moderator, a dear friend and a partner, Susan Myers, Strategic Advisor to Goal 17 Partners. Prior to Goal 17 Partners, Susan led the UN Foundation in New York and many other really important endeavors. So to that end, over to you, Susan.
Well, thank you, JR. It is really, truly a pleasure to be moderating this diverse panel of experts on such an important topic, women in the workforce, advancing progress toward gender equality. If I slip and say this evening's panel a few times, it is because it is it's 9:00 p.m. here in the New York area where I am based, but we are very pleased to be taking Goal 17 Partners series of online discussions to Asia. And as JR mentioned, this is the second in a series of 3. We hope that those of you who've joined us will join us again in 2 hours for our final session on the future of work, which is of course a topic that impacts all of us given everything happening in the world. 2020 was, of course, meant to be a very important year for gender equality and for the entire agenda. It was meant to mark the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, which was the high watermark of multilateral action on gender equality. It was also here in the US meant to mark the 100th anniversary of women being given the right to vote. And while we are, of course, still marking these moments on the calendar, the COVID-19 crisis has dramatically changed plans and the opportunities to use these moments to drive action around them. We know that crises always have a disproportionate impact on women, and COVID-19 is no different. And the impacts have been universal and far-ranging from what we've seen so far, ranging from the humanitarian aspects of the crisis. We're already seeing, and we'll talk more about it in this discussion, some of the data coming out of the UN about the millions of people being forced back into poverty, being forced back into hunger because of this issue. And we are seeing some of the impacts in the developed world as well, with some of the disturbing data coming out on the dramatically different impact on working from home on the productivity levels of women related to men. We are, of course, convening today's discussion within an Asian context, and particularly focused on Japan, given some of the partners we worked with to pull together this series, and of course, given the speakers represented on this great panel. I know that there are particular challenges in Japan. If you look at some of the numbers around the gender wage gap and women's representation in executive positions, but I think that there may also be some opportunities given some of the deft navigating of the COVID crisis that we've seen from leaders here. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from this group of experts what some of those opportunities might be at the same time we're looking at solutions for navigating the challenges. And because we are fortunate to have such a great lineup of speakers, I want to make sure we spend as much time as possible listening to them. So I will do some very quick introductions in a moment here and kick off our discussion. I do want to mention for our online audience that we want to hear from you as well. Please do use the Q&A or the chat function to submit questions. We'll concentrate that part of the discussion in the latter half of our session here. But if you have something that's particularly urgent or relevant to something that one of our speakers says, feel free to send it at any time, and we will try to work in those comments to our ongoing discussion. So I will just quickly introduce our speakers, and then we'll dive into the issues that we're here to tackle this evening. We're very pleased on this panel to have a representative of the United Nations. She's somebody who I've known for many years, Kaoru Nemoto, who runs the UN Information Center in Tokyo. Through her current role, she works with the government and other leaders on the Sustainable Development Goals agenda and other UN priorities. And she also liaises across the many different parts of the UN system represented in Tokyo. And I know she may touch upon some of the work of some of her sister agencies of the UN as well. We are also pleased to be joined by Yumiko Murakami, head of the Tokyo Center and East Asia Relations for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Previously, Yumiko served in a number of leadership positions, including in the private sector. So we know she will bring a lot of those perspectives into this discussion, which of course is focused on the role of the private sector in addition to other sectors as well. We also are very pleased to have Mihoko Kashiwakura, head of Japan Relations for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Mihoko also has a diverse background across different sectors, and we're always very happy to have the Gates Foundation joining forces with us at Goal 17 Partners, given their great work and influence and the number of priorities we share. And finally, Aragon St. Charles, Regional Operations Manager for the firm Hogan Lovells, will share his perspectives based on the work that he's done with corporate clients, cutting across issues like human resources, diversity and inclusion, corporate and social responsibility, and overall general management and strategy. So you can see why we've brought him into the discussion today. I am, of course, American, so apologies. I will perhaps conduct this panel a bit more informally than is of custom in your part of the world, and will address everyone by their, quote, first names, if that's okay. That will allow me to do a better job, I think, of leading the discussion. So Kaoru, I would like to start with you, and I would like to give you our special thanks as you've collaborated with Goal 17 Partners and Global Perspectives on this series and given us a lot of great advice along the way. I'd also, of course, thank you. I'd also like to start with you because we did just conclude a very important moment on the UN calendar, which is the high-level political forum, the annual moment when the UN and world leaders assess progress on the SDGs. Given everything that's happened this year, it's no surprise that one of the big themes of the HLPF was the impact of COVID-19 on the SDGs. I know that there's already a number of important data coming out on that topic, but could you just give us a sense of some of the headlines coming out of the HLPF? I know your office was engaged in those events, and also, of course, some of the information related to gender and other aspects of the SDG agenda that relate to gender.
Mm-hmm. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude to Goal 17 Partners and Global Perspectives for inviting me to this excellent panel. It is a unique opportunity to bring Japan's good practices and the experience in addressing SDGs to the global discussion. So I particularly thank you for this. As you mentioned, yes, the high-level political forum, which is the annual moment for the UN to bring actors engaged in SDGs together to take stock about SDGs progress and way forward, took place from 7th to 16th July. So 8-day marathon talks. And it was held 100% virtually. And I must say, the overall principle of SDGs, which is no one will be left behind, that was so strongly felt by all participants. And in fact, this year was meant to be the auspicious moment for the UN. You touched on 25 years from Beijing Conference on Women. It is a 75th anniversary for the UN. And also, it is the first year of decade of action to deliver on the promises of SDGs. And also, 20 years since the landmark Security Council Resolution 1325, which on women, peace, and security, which is the first Security Council resolution on gender-based violence in conflict situation, bringing under the purview of international peace and security under the purview of Security Council. Unfortunately, despite all these auspicious moments, we are facing the most challenging global crisis since the establishment of the United Nations and since the end of World War II. It started off as a public health crisis, but soon it unfolded into human crisis, humanitarian crisis, economic crisis, financial crisis, and the development crisis. More than 14 million people have died, have been contracted, and also 600,000 people died, lost their lives. And we are experiencing the sharpest decline in per capita income since 1870. So it's biblical. And the progress made in addressing SDGs have been wiped out by COVID-19. For example, up to 100 million people would be pushed into extreme poverty this year. And also the number of those in acute malnutrition will double by the end of this year in comparison with last year. And the COVID-19 pandemic is now exposing inequality so visibly. And women and girls are disproportionately affected by COVID-19. For example, women constitute 70% of healthcare workers and social services providers. They are at more risk, exposed to risk of COVID-19. And they are more in informal sectors. And also women are working in industry sectors most hard hit by COVID-19, such as accommodation, food industry, wholesale and retail industry. So women are disproportionately affected, and that also goes to girls. Girls, they are the first one to drop from school and the last one to go back to school. Because of the school closures, up to 1.6 billion students and the children could not go to school. And in terms of girls in developing countries, oftentimes they are forced into child labor. So we also have to be reminded that the climate crisis is unfolding at no mercy when we are addressing COVID-19. For example, the extraordinary heat in Siberia, melting the permafrost and releasing methane, that's unfolding at speed, and also extreme weather events hitting this part of the world, China and Japan. And the women are those who are hit by climate crisis most. And the scientists also see that environmental destruction and climate change are behind the emergence of novel coronaviruses such as this COVID-19. Now, at the high-level political forum, we all agreed that there is no going back to old normal, which allowed the emergence of COVID-19 crisis. So we have to build back better towards new normal with more equitable, inclusive, greener, and climate resilient sustainable society. And SDGs and Paris Agreement shows the compass for that. On 18th of July, soon after the closure of a high-level political forum, our Secretary General gave a special lecture at the Nelson Mandela Day, and he outlined his new social contract and new global deal, and he is stressing education and the digital technology as equalizers and enablers to overcome the inequalities unfolding in this world. So I will stop here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. I mean, that is, of course, an overwhelming and devastating amount of information in some ways, but it is very important for grounding this discussion and any discussion around achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, given the point of history we're in. And I think it makes some of the issues where the Secretary General has tried to organize leadership to accelerate the agenda, to make us work differently together, all the more important. So thank you for that tour of the world in a way, and for giving us a sense of some of the discussions that just concluded, not just in New York, but around the world, because of, as you said, they were fully virtual this year. Yumiko, I would like to turn to you. This is, of course, a series focused on sustainability in Asia, though given the makeup of this panel, we also will be talking a bit about Japan. Could you give us a sense of the status of gender equality in the region, and including in Japan, and bring us back to this question about what some of the particular challenges might be, but also some of the opportunities given the ongoing COVID-19 crisis?
Sure. First of all, thank you very much for having me in this really interesting discussion. I would like to focus on two issues with regard to the gender parity, especially in Japan as well as other Asian countries, especially in the context of this pandemic that has caused a number of new challenges, as well as old challenges that have become even bigger challenges. So one of them is the fact that there is a huge gap between men and women in terms of unpaid work. This is something that has been more noticed by many people because of the fact that school closure has forced us to work from home with kids running around. I have experienced this myself, and as I said before, the unpaid work in terms of how much work is done by men and women without being paid. This issue has been always around, but because of the fact that the school closure has been the case for many countries, this issue has become much bigger issue. Just to give you a sense, especially in Japan, the difference between men and women is pretty stunning. A woman spent 224 minutes versus men spending 41 minutes a day. Okay, that's a pretty pretty big gap. Similar sort of situation in Korea. Women spend 215 minutes a day versus men spending 49 minutes a day. It's slightly different depending on the country in Asia. For example, China has a little bit better, not so much, than Korea and Japan. But in terms of China, women spend 234 minutes a day versus men spending 91 minutes a day. Again, these are unpaid work minutes. Now look at the Australia situation. Men spend 172 minutes a day versus women 311. Okay, much better. Still, women spend a lot more time, but much better. New Zealand, and if I could consider them as part of sort of Pan-Pacific Asian family, 141 minutes by men, New Zealand men, versus 264 minutes by women. So you see there are a slightly different situations depending on the country in Asia. But again, the big theme here is there is a huge gap in terms of how much work is done unpaid by men and women. And this has become a major problem. Susan, as you mentioned, productivity is very different. When you work from home, when children are at home, what happens? Women productivity tends to go down, and men who may not be spending as much time as women in terms of taking care of children or doing homework, the chores at work at home, their productivity may be actually improving. So this has become a major problem that we need to focus on in terms of how we can make sure that productivity is enhanced for both men and women equally. Especially in Japan or other Asian countries where there's a huge gap between men and women in this regard. The other point that I wanted to bring up here is this is something that is probably going to be even worse if we don't address this issue right now, is the fact that automation is going to be accelerated because of the fact that a lot of people working from home, companies are introducing robotics and automation at much faster pace than before because of this crisis. Now, what will happen as a result of automation, as a result of introduction of robotics at workplace, is going to have a different sort of impact depending on the skill levels in terms of technology of workers. And what I'm trying to say is people who are in a middle skill level versus high level skills when it comes to working with technology, they are the ones who are most likely to be replaced by automation or robotics. And we know for a fact that women, more than men, tend to be in the middle skill range. So we need to be very careful in terms of how the job market is going to be impacted by the introduction or acceleration of robotics or automation. We need to make sure that both men and women are trained and reskilled to make sure they are well-equipped, well-skilled to work with the robotics or technology-rich environment. And otherwise, again, the job market is already going through a very difficult time, but it might be going forward worse for women who tend to be more in the middle skill range in terms of where they are, in terms of what they have, in terms of their knowledge and skill levels, in terms of working with technology. So I just stop right there. These are global issues, but in particular, very important for Japan and other Asian countries where there are already a number of gender related discrepancies, especially when it comes to skill levels, especially when it comes to unpaid work, sort of obligations placed on men and women. So those are the 2 points I wanted to make.
Well, thank you, Yumiko. And I was going to comment on the fact that this discussion is, I think, going to shift back and forth between some of the global perspectives on the issue and also some of the opportunities and challenges that are particular to the region. And we're intentionally doing that. When it comes to gender equality, I think that every part of the world does have particular challenges and opportunities. And we, by, of course, no means mean to single out this particular region because no nation is really on track right now to achieve gender equality. This was before COVID-19, so even more so now. But because of the focus, thank you so much for those remarks. Because of the focus of those remarks, I'm going to flip up my order a little bit because I think, Ariane, if I could turn to you, the question I was going to ask you, I think might follow on a little bit more from Yumiko's remarks. You are, not to state the obvious, of course, the sole man represented on this panel. So thank you very much for bearing that burden. And you're not chosen just because you're a man, you're chosen because of the work you do. But the role of men is crucial for advancing gender equality. And we've seen some really innovative efforts coming from the UN and others, like the UN Women He for She campaign, which has given many men leaders the opportunity to lead in visible ways. So how do you, as a man, see the issue of gender equality? Are there some things that men in particular can do, including to address some of the issues that Yumiko, I'm sorry, just focused on. But you know, just give us your broad perspective as well to help set the context for the discussion.
Absolutely, and similar to others, thank you very much for having me on the panel today. It is I'm privileged to be here, and I'm very happy to talk about what I, as a man, and my firm, and in general, we can do to help further gender equality. I think historically, gender equality has been seen mainly as a women's issue, and this has contributed to the perception that women are the only ones who will actually benefit from gender equality. But I think we are increasingly understanding that gender equality is not just a women's issue. The European Institute of Gender Equality noted that gender equality is an issue that affects both men and women, and notes that the benefits of equality are very clear from a moral, social, economic, and business profitability perspective. Secondly, gender equality is not a zero-sum equation. Equality for women does not mean less equality for men. And you can see comparisons to that in the Black Lives Matter movements now. Black Lives Matter doesn't mean that other lives matter less. So that's the issue of gender equality, but what impact can men have on the agenda? Well, interesting, I was doing a little bit of research before this panel, and the Boston Consulting Group Gender Diversity Survey in, I think, 2017 showed that among companies where men are actively involved in gender diversity, 96% of people polled in that company report progress on gender equality issues, whereas conversely, among companies where men are not involved in gender equality initiatives, only 30% show progress. So if those results hold true on a global level, then if we're going to see changes that we so clearly need, then clearly men also need to champion gender equality. So what can men actually do to help affect change on the issue? So again, while I was doing some research, I sort of tried to think about a few key points that would be worth discussion. What I came to the conclusion were these sort of four main ones. The first is to acknowledge that male privilege exists. And then to see how it shapes the world around us and how it disadvantages women. But not just women, of course, it disadvantages ethnic minorities, it disadvantages LGBTQ as well as women. So I think also, whilst understanding that there are differences between countries, cultures, and so forth, the underlying causes of inequality are universal, and it starts with male privilege. The second point, I think, is to be an ally, but more than, you have to go further than that. You can't be an unspoken ally. You can't stand on the sidelines and say, I wish that there was greater gender equality. I think you've got to get stuck in. You have to be, you can't be afraid to speak out against gender discrimination in society or in the workplace. And so men need to be outspoken allies for women and to insist on change. Now, this can be quite hard, in fact. A number of studies have shown that men who actually speak out on gender diversity issues can actually be viewed negatively by both men and women in the workplace. But it's still important, nevertheless, to get beyond that idea of what is masculinity and to embrace gender equality and to speak out for it. A third thing I think is really important is, I know it's something that my firm has done a lot to work with, is recognizing unconscious bias and to accept the uncomfortable truth that we all have it. But what we think is not the most important part. What we do and how we act afterwards is more important. So to accept that to some degree we all have unconscious bias, but then to make sure that we recognize it, we see it for what it is in our own processes, in our own actions, and then make sure that it doesn't come through in our actions, to make sure that that unconscious bias is not reflected in any decision-making processes. And then I think the final thing is to try to model positive behaviors. Positive behaviors and processes that empower women in the workplace to, if as a man I have a leadership role, then I should share that platform to promote women's leadership. And there are a great many opportunities for men to do this in the workplace, and I think we'll address some of those sort of more practical points later on. But in summary, I think that as a male ally, as a man, it's not enough to say that I believe in gender equality. I think I and my colleagues, we have to actually demonstrate that we believe in gender equality through our actions, to demonstrate that we are working to bring about change, and that we are doing everything in our power to promote and effect gender equality.
Great, thank you. And it sounds like it's also not just the right thing to do, it makes sense to do it. And that's always the best combination. Mihoko, I do think that some of these comments are a nice transition to the role of the Gates Foundation, who of course has been a strong leader on gender equality, both through the personal leadership of Melinda Gates, who has really taken on this issue, but also because of some of the other priorities the foundation has, which are related to other issues, but still very important to advancing gender equality. I know, of course, and not surprising to anyone, that much of the focus of the foundation is now aimed at the COVID-19 crisis, given the strong leadership role you play on the overall global health agenda. So how has the issue of COVID-19 affected your priorities related to gender and some of the ongoing programming that you work on from the Gates Foundation? And thank you again for joining our discussion.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you everybody for having me today. So I think Kaoru and Yumiko has already spoke a lot about how COVID-19 has disproportionately affected negatively towards women. At the foundation, we're going through a major change right now, I would say. We have a new gender president for the first time. A lot of our programs will have a gender sort of specific intervention across all the works that we do. And we will be going through this sort of strategy review to really integrate that gender lens across all our work. Melinda recently published a paper about the pandemic's tolls on women. And there she highlighted a lot of the unfortunate reality of women in this COVID-19 crisis. So we know that across the world, 15 million unplanned pregnancies has happened. A lot of women lost maternity support. There are about 113,000 women who were threatened their lives for not having maternity support. As Kaoru shared, we know that 70% of the health workers are women, while we are not exactly sure if our policies, if the COVID-19 response had that gender lens with in mind that the majority are women working in health facilities. And we also know that, as Yumiko shared, women are constantly doing the unpaid work at home. Women also have 1.8 times more chances of losing their jobs. And we've seen a lot of devastating news about the rise of domestic violence. Overall, I think if we don't have a strong gender lens across all our work, our policy, both in the private sector and also across governments, we know that without inclusion of women in the workforce and in the economy, we will lose up to $5 trillion by 2030. So I think it's quite critical The foundation has been sharing two critical sort of messages around this. One is about gathering the right data and collect better gender data. So understanding when we're collecting reports around COVID-19, the tests, the case, the deaths, all the data that we receive, we need to break it down and understand the sex and the age and sort of demographies as well to be able to respond in a more efficient way. And also, as we do this, there are parts of the responses that are hidden that the data will not be able to collect. So I think we need to be very much inclusive in listening to the voices of what's happening in different parts of the world. The second piece that we've been very much vocal about is integrating women's healthcare in sort of the health services as a whole. We want to ensure that classifying both sexual and reproductive healthcare services are essential services. They should not be a sideline thing. It should be one of the ongoing critical lifeline infrastructure for women. And also, as we keep in mind that the majority of the health workers are women, we need to be able to provide the necessary PPE, the personal protective equipment on the grounds. And when we have sufficient amounts of vaccines, we also want to ensure that the vaccines for the healthcare workers, women are receiving those care, are vaccinated without any kind of bias that could be ingrained in the environment. So those are the two, data and healthcare lens of having sort of women's needs addressed are two things that we've been sharing in this COVID-19 response.
Great, thank you. And I know the Gates Foundation has, of course, been a very strong leader on having better data and more timely data, and including, focused on gender. And I think more and more now we're seeing how important that is. Well, for the next part of the discussion, I think we'd like to focus a bit more on kind of the economic case for gender equality and also the business case for it, since this is a discussion somewhat focused on the role of business, given the nature of Goal 17 Partners' work. Yumiko, it looks like you may have had a little bit of technical difficulties, but you're back. I just want to make sure you can hear us okay. Great.
I think you're fine.
Okay, great. I did want to turn to you next, given your role with the OECD, to just, help us focus a bit more on the economic side of things. We see some of the numbers around the tremendous economic benefit that focusing more on gender parity can do to drive economies. How is all of that shifting given COVID-19, or maybe it's not, and we just need to stay focused on that? Please share with us a bit more.
Sure. I think there are ample evidence to really demonstrate how economically we will all benefit if we could promote gender parity. So I'm not going to go into details, but just from the private sector perspectives, which obviously is going to be very important, because at the end of the day, you need to have incentives to drive private sector companies to really push forward gender equality. So there are a number of case studies that have been done in terms of how ROEs and just in general, profitability indicators are actually higher when you have a much more diverse team of leadership, and in general, much better balanced workforce. But it's really difficult when you have a very small percentage of women representing in the decision-making process. Even if you have a very healthy portion of labor force, coming from a female. And that's the case in Japan. So I just want to give you a sense in terms of what's been happening in Japan. The Japanese government has been promoting women to work more, especially in the last 5-6 years, when the administration has been launching and pushing this female participation into the labor market. And quite frankly, they have done a good job. If you look at the female labor market participation rate, that's been steadily going up. Now it's higher than the average of OECD countries. Now, the problem here is very few women actually reach the top management levels in the private sector or government. If you look at the parliamentarian ratio in terms of men and women, still extremely low. So what that means is that female voices are not part of the decision-making process. And that is really hurting not only the government in terms of how they are making decisions right now. Look at the decisions that are being made by the government in terms of controlling the virus, pandemic. We need to have a much better or much more balanced views that are coming from, a bunch of different, experts in different sort of fields. And that's not exactly what we're seeing in some governments, in particular, in the case of Japan. Let's look at the private sector. It's the same thing. It's a situation that the private sector companies are facing. The situation where there's very little visibility. You just cannot predict what may happen tomorrow to your company, to your business environment. In that case, what do you need to do? You need to have as many different voices as possible in the decision-making process so that your options are bigger. Your options are much wider than what you would have if you were to make these important decisions based on a very small or narrow wide of opinions or views. And that's exactly what private sector companies need to do, because at the end of the day, there are really no clear answers. We have never experienced this before. No one has. No company has. So this is a situation where the leadership has to embrace a very, very wide range of perspectives, a very, very wide range of expertise, voices, so that they can actually see potential solutions outside the box. Again, both the private sector as well as the government. Just because we don't have textbook to follow. We don't have a clear sort of a path that we have seen before, and we can say, oh, this has happened before. Let's do this to solve the problem. And I think this is really important. And this actually ties into the question of, for example, innovation, right? Innovation is something that you need to do without, basically having a very clear answer, or clue or leads presented in front of the eyes. We need to have leadership structure where innovative ideas are well embraced and really take into the consideration of the fact this is something that no one has ever experienced. Again, both private sector companies and the government. And therefore, it's extremely important for private sector companies, if they are going to survive this crisis by having very innovative solutions, if they are to retain their economic viability after this crisis and grow their businesses, they need to look around and see who is sitting around the table when they make these very important strategic decisions. And look at them and see, oh, do we all look like the same kind of people? Or are we having different type of voices? I think that's exactly what companies need to do. So I stop right there.
Yeah. And Yumiko, several things that you said actually made me think of the UN Secretary General, not because I know him personally, but I'm familiar with some of the areas that he has chosen to lead and some of the decisions he's made about his own leadership style to support gender equality. So Kaoru, I think I'd like to turn to you next. This was, of course, meant to be an important year for the UN on gender equality. The Secretary General from day one decided that this was an issue he wanted to lead on. What are some of the specific things that he is doing now? And he's also, of course, very much focused on the role of the private sector in driving leadership and action. So what are some of the things the UN would like to see more of from business?
Well, our Secretary General calls himself feminist. And from day one, he was trying to lead by example by appointing talented and capable women to senior leadership roles. So in 1 year since his taking office, half of the boardroom, so to speak, as a senior management team of the Secretary General were women. And now we have also achieved gender parity at the UN resident coordinator level, which is the UN representative in developing countries coordinating sustainable development work of UN system at large in developing countries. And by 2028, we aim to achieve gender parity at all levels. Now, gender equality and women's empowerment is not just the right thing to do, but also good for business. And yesterday, echoing with Yumiko, yesterday I found a very interesting article in the Nikkei. So there is MSCI Japan Empowering Women Index, and that index shows more stability and gain than topics in general. So it's good for business. And speaking at ESG investment angle, yes, having an environment where women can take leadership roles, that's good for society, and also that's good for diverse governance point of view too. And me, as director of UN Communications, UN Information Center, I deal a lot with media companies. And there are 24 Japanese media companies who have joined SDG Media Compact, which is a forum between the UN and media companies in addressing SDGs. And when I meet the senior leadership from these media companies, powerful media companies, I repeat my mantra. So how many women directors do you have? How many women executives do you have? And how much women making decision on content creation? Because Aragon talked about unbiased bias, unconscious bias. And I think to beat unconscious bias and stereotype, media plays a very, very important role. So how media describes women and women's roles, that creeps deep into our psyche. So we need more diversity, women in the content production and management of media companies. Over.
Okay, thank you. And Aragon, I would like to turn to you just, to kind of, amplify this point about the business case and, specific things that companies can do to lead on gender equality. Are there particular things you encourage, your clients and the companies you work with to do beyond kind of the general playbook you laid out for the role of men? And are there particular, solutions that you have seen that have worked well to help women, both develop, within their companies into leadership roles, but also to just help the leadership role of the private sector overall? And I do see we have some good questions coming in. We will, in just a few minutes, start turning to audience questions. So if you have questions, please do send them.
So I think that culture is a key role in companies, and defining what your company culture is meant to be, and it should include all manner of equality, whether it's gender equality, LGBTQ, ethnic minorities, differently abled, and so forth. Embracing putting culture at the forefront of your business strategy, I think, is incredibly important. It's something that we've focused on for many years now, and we have seen tremendous results as a base because we put culture front and center. And I think that there are a lot of things that we can do to promote gender equality in the workplace. I'll list a few of them, but one, listen. Just listen properly. Real listening is about focus, sincerity, empathy, refusal to interrupt, and genuinely valuing a female colleague's experience and her willingness to share it with you. I think sometimes men can be very, and I confess, I will hold my hand up to say I am often guilty of this, can be quite action orientated. We just want to, find the solution. But in fact, I think it's more important that we have to listen. Linked to that is trying to embrace fair communications. In meetings, it's generally acknowledged that men tend to speak about 70%, 70 to 80% of the time. And so something that you can practically do is to ensure that you're soliciting opinions from women, from those who are less confident to speak, and to ensure that their voice is heard in every single meeting. To call out interruptions of female colleagues. Men are far more likely to interrupt a female colleague than they are a male colleague. So when you hear it, stand up and say, hang on, I was listening to that lady, please can you let her finish? And don't allow the interruptions. And of course, don't tolerate mansplaining. When a woman says something and then a man feels the need to explain it in his own words immediately afterwards. Therefore, taking credit for that idea, you have to call that out and to stop those behaviors. And of course, you have to model it yourself first, but you have to make sure that you're calling it out when others are doing it. Yumiko, you mentioned about representation at decision-making levels, and it's key. It's incredibly important. In the legal industry, we have an initiative, particularly in the US, called the Mansfield Rule, which sets a benchmark that women, minority, disabled, and LGBTQ+ lawyers should make up at least 30% of the candidate pool for key leadership roles. Now, this is something that we were an early signatory at Hogan Lovells, and we actually have Mansfield Plus certification for exceeding the benchmarks and ensuring that not just that the candidate pool is 30%, but the actual panels or leadership groups themselves have key representatives from women or LGBTQ and so forth. So on all panels, boards, leadership teams and so forth, you've got to have fair representation. And this also leads into the idea of a lens of intersectionality. So it's not just women, it is LGBTQ+, it is ethnic minorities and so forth. It might be standing up and saying, look, I'm on this panel, but I notice that there's no women, so I'm not going to participate, and I insist that you take my position and replace it with a woman, or just insisting that panels have women on them. I think you have to be able to stand up and insist that these things happen if they are not already. I think another thing that we can focus on, whether it's legal or any industry, is mentoring and coaching support for women. Now, mentoring may well be by other women, might be preferable, but men have to be supportive of that and to ensure that women are given opportunities for mentoring to get them to the higher levels of leadership roles that they need to be on. Several of the panelists have mentioned about the burden of unpaid work falling on women, and that is absolutely true. But having agile working policies is something that can help, particularly working mothers, and all firms, all companies should, I think, implement agile working policies to some degree to show their support for women in the workplace. We've mentioned previously unconscious bias training. Anyone who's in a management or leadership position should have that. And finally, men need to get involved with firm-wide initiatives to show and to demonstrate that they're important, particularly when men in leadership positions, CEOs, COOs, and so forth, when they join those committees and listen and take part, it sends a clear message to the entire firm that this is important and that they want to be part of the solution. I think that's important as well.
Thank you. And Mihoko, I'm going to both turn to you with the question I was intending to ask you and kind of bringing it back to a global perspective, given the breadth of the foundation's work. But I'm going to work in a couple of the questions that have come in from our audience because they relate to things we can do to better inspire women to take up more leadership positions in, both politics and business, but also some of the cultural issues that we can navigate to promote gender equality. And I know that these are some of the issues that the Gates Foundation thinks about in its work. Are there any things you're seeing through your programming in other parts of the world that we can learn from, not just both for this region but also more generally, and just kind of, is there anything that's happening on the global level that we should be inspired by? Because I think this is a time we all do need inspiration.
So I think we've seen amazing leadership from some of the women political leaders. Like we've seen amazing leadership from Germany's Chancellor Merkel to New Zealand, Taiwan. A lot of the female leaders who responded really well in COVID-19 are female. So I think this is an opportunity to really rebuild our economy with those gender lens in place. And I think, as many of our panelists shared today, I think it's quite critical to really include in the decision-making process women's voice and ensure that we have those lenses in place. If I may just go a bit tangent, personally, in Japan, I also work on, outside of Gates Foundation work, I run this children cafeteria where we serve free meals, free dinners to some families who are in need. What we've been noticing, now we're changing to food delivery. We've been noticing a lot of single women, single parents, mothers, really struggling to find food, find a new job. A lot of times we hear voices like, oh, this is our first meal, our first meat in weeks, or we just lost all our rice. So I know that a lot of people already know, but if you are a single mother in Japan, your 58% of them are under the poverty line. And so when we consider all these things, one of the best news that came out recently for me personally was the LDP, Prime Minister Abe's party, has finally moved around childcare payments. So when you're divorced in Japan, most mothers, only 24% of the mothers receive money from their divorced fathers. And now this has been noticed by data. The policies are now moving. And I was shocked to see that only 43% of divorced couples agree on terms about the money and the financials. And this is something that's quite shocking if you compare it in other countries. But this shows how much, like, if you have the right set of data, if you have the right set of policy, huge changes can be made. And what I noticed by talking with these single mothers are basically, they're very talented. They're very, some of them can be very highly educated. It's just that they get married. Unfortunately, they get divorced. Unfortunately, the fathers don't send any money. So they end up in these part-time jobs, sort of not so stable jobs. This environment can completely change if we take this opportunity to really rebuild the economy based on women's voice, the voice of the majority of where the needs are coming from. So at the foundation, we are devastated when we see the data of what's happening to women across the world. But I also think it's a great time and opportunity to really rebuild with an inclusive sort of decision-making process, as well as having a very strong gender lens.
I think that's an excellent point. It's amazing how quickly an hour goes. We are nearing our time, but I think that's an excellent point for us to think about as we start concluding this discussion. We have actually touched on some of the issues that have also come in through the Q&A, including around the impact of some of these issues on developed countries, and including what COVID-19 has brought to countries who maybe weren't expecting to be dealing with the level of issues that they are now. I think we have a couple of minutes left. I think I would like to maybe just call on each panelist for a final word, call to action, something you really want our online audience and partners to think about on gender equality as we approach the rest of the year. Yumiko, we could start with you.
I would say the silver lining of this pandemic is the fact that I think at home, men realize how much work is done by women, the wives. So that must have been a wake-up call. Now that they are spending probably more time at home, working from home, they realize that there has been, there is an opportunity for men to do more at home. At the leadership level, as Mihoko mentioned, many of the successful leaders around the world who have dealt with a crisis well are women. And I think a lot of the people who are in the decision-making positions, they are just looking at ourselves and trying to figure out what is the secret sauce. And I think I hope they realize that this is the environment where no one knows clear answer. What do they need to do? They need to listen. And I think that's one of the things that I think a lot of leaders are just realizing that they haven't done well enough to our point earlier. So the silver lining for leaders is the fact that they are much, much, much better leaders when they have the ear to listen to different voices. Look at the leadership that has done really well in the countries where the pandemic has been contained relatively well. Those are the leaders who listened. So I hope that will be the case going forward for many other countries' leaders as well.
Great. Aragon, you also made this point about listening. Is there another final point you would like to make?
Yeah, from a male perspective, I think it's getting comfortable with being uncomfortable, getting comfortable with having discussions that you may not want to really know the answers to looking at privilege and realizing that it may actually be part of your own success, not your innate talent, looking at unconscious bias and realizing that there may be aspects that you weren't aware of and that you need to check. And so I think just getting comfortable with being a little uncomfortable and having those conversations and taking part in anything related to gender equality. It's not a women's issue. It's an issue for male and female. So get comfortable with that idea.
Thank you. Mihoko, any final points from you? And Kaoru will then end with you.
Well, if any of the participants are interested in working around reskilling single mothers and I'm trying to bring a network of sort of mentoring as well as connecting these amazing talented single mothers to HR type partners. If anybody is interested, please reach out to me. I'll be more than happy to have you join and sort of brainstorm on this sort of ongoing project. It's a personal project, but it's something that I'm very passionate about. So thank you for having me today.
Thank you. Kaoru, thank you. And what final points would you like us to remember as we enter this even more critical?
COVID-19 has given us tremendous pain, but at the same time, tremendous opportunity to transform ourselves and also our world. And I am particularly encouraged by voices coming from private sector here in Japan that they are more interested in SDGs and sustainability and SDGs as the compass to navigate us through this very painful period. And no one will be left behind. That's the overall principle of SDGs, including gender equality and women's empowerment. And that importance of this principle has been disclosed so clearly by this pandemic. So in a nutshell, I hope, we can get best out of this turmoil altogether.
I do as well. Thank you very much. And thank you to all of our panelists for giving us an hour of your day. For our online audience, we will be continuing this series with one final session in just 1 hour from now, focused on the future of work, and we'll be, I think, continuing some of the discussion around gender equality as well. which is very much building on this discussion. So thank you again. Please stay tuned to Goal 17 Partners and Global Perspectives for our continued work and convening around these important issues. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.